In the autumn of 1940, a black metal deed box crossed the Atlantic Ocean aboard a passenger liner called the Duchess of Richmond. The box had been specially designed for this voyage. If a German torpedo struck the ship, the container would fill with water and sink straight to the bottom of the Atlantic. The secret it carried was never meant to fall into enemy hands. Inside that box sat a copper device roughly the size of a man's fist. It weighed less than a kilogram, and it looked like nothing more than a small cylinder with holes drilled through it. To an untrained eye, it could have been a piece of industrial scrap. But this unremarkable object would change the course of the Second World War. Years later, the official historian of the United States government would describe what the British delivered that autumn. He wrote that they carried the most valuable cargo ever brought to American shores. Not gold, not diamonds, not secret battle plans. A palm-sized piece of copper built in a university laboratory by two men who were not even on that ship. One of those men would receive a knighthood 17 years after the war ended. The other would never receive one at all. They invented the same device on the same day in the same room, and history would treat them very differently. But in 1940, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was survival. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, and the nation was slowly being strangled. Not from the air, but from beneath the waves. Who were these two forgotten inventors? And why was Britain so desperate that it gave away its greatest secret for free? To understand why Britain gave away its greatest secret, you first have to understand how desperate the situation had become. By the summer of 1940, France had fallen. The British Army had escaped from Dunkirk, but they left almost all their equipment behind on the beaches. Nazi Germany controlled everything from Norway to the Spanish border. Britain stood completely alone. Then came the Blitz. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers pounded London. By the time the bombing campaign ended, 43,000 civilians across Britain would lose their lives. Over 1 million homes in London alone were damaged or destroyed. The medieval cathedral at Coventry was reduced to rubble in a single night. But the bombs were not the real threat. The real danger was invisible, and it lurked beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. German U-boats were strangling the island nation. Britain needed over 1 million tons of imported supplies every single week just to survive. Food, fuel, steel, aluminium. Almost everything had to come by ship across the Atlantic, and the U-boats were having what their commanders gleefully called the happy time. Between June and October of 1940, German submarines sank 274 merchant ships. In October alone, they sent 352,000 tons of supplies to the bottom of the ocean. Ships were going down faster than British shipyards could build replacements. Years later, Winston Churchill would admit in his memoirs that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat threat. Not the Luftwaffe, not the threat of invasion, the submarines. And the problem was devastatingly simple. The U-boats would surface at night to recharge their batteries. In the darkness of the Atlantic, they were essentially invisible to any ship or aircraft trying to find them. Britain had radar. The chain-home system had helped win the Battle of Britain just months earlier. But it could not solve this problem. And the reason why reveals everything about what Randall and Boot were about to achieve. The chain-home radar system was a triumph of British engineering. It had given the Royal Air Force precious minutes of warning before each Luftwaffe attack. Those extra minutes were enough to scramble Spitfires and Hurricanes into the air before the German bombers arrived over their targets. Without chain home, the Battle of Britain might have ended very differently. It was one of the main reasons the island nation survived the summer of 1940. But Chain Home had a fundamental limitation, and that limitation was physics itself. The system used radio waves between 10 and 13 meters long. To put that in perspective, each wave was longer than a double-decker bus. And to transmit and receive waves of that size, you needed enormous antenna structures. The transmitter masts stood over 110 meters tall, supported by massive steel frameworks. The wooden receiver towers reached nearly 80 meters into the sky. These were not portable devices. They were permanent installations, bolted firmly to the ground along the British coastline, requiring constant maintenance and huge amounts of electrical power. You cannot put a 100-meter tower on the deck of a destroyer. You certainly cannot squeeze one inside the fuselage of a patrol aircraft. The equipment was simply too large, too heavy, and too power-hungry to go anywhere except fixed positions on land. And there was another serious problem that the engineers had discovered. Chain Home was specifically designed to detect aircraft flying at high altitude, formations of bombers cruising at several thousand meters above the ground. The system worked brilliantly for that exact purpose. But anything flying low, below approximately 500 meters, simply disappeared into what radar operators called ground clutter. The returning signals bounced off hills, buildings, and waves on the sea, creating a mess of noise on the screen that masked any low-flying aircraft. German pilots figured this out remarkably quickly. Their mine-laying aircraft began flying just above the waves, slipping beneath the radar coverage to drop their deadly cargo in British shipping lanes. Chain Home operators would stare at their screens and see nothing, while magnetic mines splashed into the water below. Against submarines, the system was completely and utterly useless. A U-boat on the surface presented a tiny target, barely visible even in daylight. At night, when the submarines surfaced to recharge their batteries and refresh their air supply, they were essentially invisible to any ship or aircraft trying to find them. Chain Home could not help. It was never designed for this kind of threat. The solution seemed obvious to the physicists working on the problem. If you wanted radar that could fit inside an aircraft or be mounted on a ship's mast, you needed to use much shorter wavelengths. Instead of radio waves measured in meters, you needed waves measured in centimeters. These shorter waves were called microwaves. The mathematics were elegant and simple. Shorter wavelengths meant smaller antennas. With centimeter waves, your entire antenna assembly could be compact enough to fit in the nose cone of a Wellington bomber. You could mount a rotating dish on a patrol aircraft hunting U-boats across the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic. You could install one on every escort vessel protecting the convoys. You could finally see what was lurking out there in the darkness, waiting to strike. There was also a tactical advantage that made microwave radar even more attractive. Shorter wavelengths produced narrower, more focused beams. That meant better accuracy, sharper images, and the ability to distinguish smaller targets. A centimetric radar might actually be able to spot the periscope of a submarine, or pick out a single surfaced U-boat against the background clutter of ocean waves. But there was a catch. A very serious one. Nobody in the world could generate enough microwave power to make such a radar actually work. The problem was not theoretical. Scientists understood perfectly well how useful centimetric radar would be. The problem was entirely practical. The existing technology simply could not produce the power levels required. The best American devices, called klystrons, produced roughly 10 watts at centimeter wavelengths. 10 watts was enough to conduct laboratory experiments. It was nowhere near enough to detect a submarine at any useful distance. Practical airborne radar needed at least 1,000 watts to be effective. That meant someone had to find a way to increase the power output by a factor of 100. The United States Navy, with all its resources and funding, officially admitted that their researchers had reached a dead end. American scientists had tried everything they could think of. Nothing worked. The power barrier seemed insurmountable. The problem appeared to be fundamentally unsolvable with existing technology. But at the University of Birmingham, in the industrial heartland of England, two men were about to be given the task of solving it anyway. One was 34 years old, an established physicist who had already earned a fellowship from the Royal Society for his work on luminescent materials. The other was just 22, a doctoral student who had not yet finished writing his thesis when the war interrupted his studies. Neither of them came from wealth or privilege. Neither had studied at Oxford or Cambridge, and neither had any idea that they were about to change the course of history. John Turton Randall was not the sort of man you would expect to find at the cutting edge of military research. He was born in 1905 in Newton-le-Willows, a small town in Lancashire. His father, Sidney, was a nurseryman and seedsman, a man who worked with his hands in the soil, growing plants and selling seeds to local customers. His mother, Hannah, came from a family of coal miners. This was not the background that typically produced British scientists. There were no family connections to Oxford or Cambridge, no inherited wealth, no doors opened by a famous surname. Randall earned his education the hard way. He attended the local grammar school, then won a place at the University of Manchester, a solid institution, but not one of the ancient elite universities that dominated British science. He graduated with first-class honors in physics and stayed on to complete his doctorate. By 1937, he had built a reputation as an expert on luminescent powders, the glowing materials used inside fluorescent lamps. His colleagues would later describe him as an original and even somewhat maverick scientist. He had a restless intelligence, always looking for unconventional solutions to difficult problems. He did not care much for hierarchy or tradition. What mattered to him was whether an idea actually worked. Harry Boot was 12 years younger, and his background was remarkably similar. He was born in 1917 in Hall Green, a suburb of Birmingham. His father, Henry, was an electrical engineer who worked at a company called Bellings. Unlike Randall, Boot grew up surrounded by wires, circuits, and practical engineering problems. He learned to work with his hands before he ever opened a physics textbook. Boot attended King Edward's High School in Birmingham, then enrolled at the University of Birmingham to study physics. He was a promising student, just beginning his doctoral research when the war broke out in September 1939. He was 22 years old, and his thesis remained unfinished. The war had interrupted everything. The man who brought them together was Professor Mark Oliphant. Oliphant was an Australian physicist with a formidable reputation. He had worked under Ernest Rutherford at Cambridge and helped discover tritium and helium-3. He would later become a key figure in the Manhattan Project. In 1937, he had taken the chair of physics at Birmingham, and when war came, the Admiralty asked him to focus his laboratory on the radar problem. Oliphant had visited the United States and seen the American klystron tubes. He understood immediately that they were far too weak for practical radar. 10 watts was nothing. He needed something that could produce real power at centimeter wavelengths. He looked around his department for someone who might think differently about the problem, and he paired the experienced Randall with the young Boot. It was an unusual combination. Randall was a Royal Society Research Fellow with over a decade of industrial experience. Boot was still technically a student. But Oliphant saw something in both of them. He gave them a simple instruction: find a way to generate powerful microwaves. In November of 1939, Randall and Boot sat together in the Birmingham Physics Laboratory, surrounded by notebooks and journals, trying to understand why every existing approach had failed. And then Randall remembered something. He recalled reading about the work of Heinrich Hertz, the German physicist who had first demonstrated the existence of radio waves back in the 1880s. Hertz had used simple loops of wire as resonators, structures that vibrated at specific frequencies, like tiny tuning forks for electromagnetic waves. What if you could combine that resonator principle with the existing magnetron design? The idea came to them in a single afternoon. They sketched it out on paper. They argued about the details. And by the end of that day in November 1939, they believed they had a solution. But believing is not the same as proving. They needed to build a prototype, and they had almost nothing to build it with. No special funding, no dedicated workshop, no precision manufacturing equipment. Just a block of copper, a glass bell jar, some wax for sealing, and the largest horseshoe magnet they could find in the entire building. The Poynting building at the University of Birmingham was not an impressive place. It was a functional brick structure, home to the physics department, filled with cluttered laboratories and the constant hum of electrical equipment. No one walking past would have guessed that history was about to be made inside. Randall and Boot had spent weeks building their prototype. They worked with whatever materials they could find in the department. The device they created looked almost absurdly simple. A solid block of copper, roughly the size of a man's fist, with 6 cylindrical holes drilled straight through it in a circular pattern. If you looked at the cross-section, it resembled nothing so much as the chamber of a Colt revolver. In fact, some of the early prototypes were actually cut using tooling borrowed from a pistol manufacturer. The copper block was fitted with a central cathode, a thin wire that would emit electrons when heated. The whole assembly was placed inside a glass bell jar, and the air was pumped out to create a vacuum. Then they positioned it between the poles of the largest horseshoe magnet they could find anywhere in the building. The gaps and joints were sealed with ordinary wax. It was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It looked like something a clever student might build for a school project. On the 21st of February, 1940, Randall and Boot connected their device to a power supply. They switched it on, and they waited. The readings on their instruments made no sense. They checked the equipment. They ran the numbers again. They looked at each other in disbelief. The device was producing 400 watts of power at a wavelength of 9.8 centimeters. 400 watts. The best klystrons in America could barely manage 10. This crude assembly of copper and wax and vacuum glass was generating nearly 100 times more microwave power than anything else in the world. They had done it. The impossible problem had been solved in a provincial university laboratory with basic equipment by 2 men working essentially alone. But that was only the beginning. Within 1 week, they had pushed the output past 1,000 watts. By July of 1940, an improved version was producing 25,000 watts. And by May of 1941, the cavity magnetron would reach 1 million watts of power. A 3 orders of magnitude improvement in barely more than a year. From 400 watts to 1 million. It was one of the most dramatic technological leaps in the history of science. The device they had created was small enough to hold in one hand. It weighed less than a kilogram, and it could generate more microwave power than entire rooms full of American equipment. 2 men from ordinary backgrounds, working in an ordinary building, had just handed Britain the key to winning the war at sea. But inventing something is not the same as deploying it. The magnetron existed. It worked. Now someone had to convince the military that it mattered. Someone had to figure out how to manufacture it in quantity, and someone had to do all of this while German bombs were falling on British cities and factories every single night. Britain had the invention. What it did not have was the industrial capacity to mass produce it. The engineers at the General Electric Company in Wembley worked with remarkable speed. Within just a few months of the Birmingham breakthrough, they had transformed the crude laboratory prototype into something entirely different. A sealed, reliable, production-ready unit that could survive the vibrations and stresses of military use. The new version was compact enough to fit inside an aircraft. It was air-cooled rather than water-cooled, which made it far more practical for operational deployment. It could generate a sustained 10,000 watts of microwave power. The engineers designated it the E1189, and by the summer of 1940, they had manufactured a small batch of working units. The cavity magnetron was ready for war. But Britain was not ready to build it in the numbers that would actually matter. The Blitz had changed everything. Every night, German bombers droned over British cities, dropping their deadly cargo on factories, shipyards, and residential areas alike. Coventry had been devastated. London was burning. Industrial facilities across the Midlands were being systematically targeted by the Luftwaffe. Skilled workers were being called up for military service faster than they could be replaced. Raw materials that had once flowed freely from overseas were now at the bottom of the Atlantic, sent there by U-boat torpedoes. The shipyards were working triple shifts just to replace the merchant vessels being lost every week. Aircraft factories were struggling to produce enough Spitfires and Hurricanes to replace combat losses. There was simply no capacity left, no spare workers, no available factory floor space, no way to establish an entirely new manufacturing industry for a revolutionary technology that required precision engineering and exotic materials. Britain had invented the cavity magnetron, but Britain could not mass produce it. And a weapon that cannot be manufactured in quantity is not really a weapon at all. Sir Henry Tizard understood this bitter reality better than almost anyone in the British government. He was the architect of British radar, the man who had personally convinced the Air Ministry to build the chain home system back in the mid-1930s. He had spent years thinking about how science and technology could help win wars. He knew that invention alone was not enough. You needed industrial capacity to turn ideas into impact. And now, Tizard proposed something that many in the British establishment considered absolutely unthinkable. Give it to the Americans. Share everything. Hold nothing back. Not just the magnetron, everything. Every secret, every blueprint, every piece of advanced technology that British scientists had developed. Winston Churchill was far from enthusiastic when the proposal reached his desk. Sharing military secrets with a neutral nation, even a friendly one, went against every instinct the Prime Minister possessed. Britain had fought alone for months. British cities were burning. British sailors were perishing in the cold Atlantic. And now someone was suggesting they simply hand over their most valuable secrets to a country that was not even in the war. His scientific advisor, Lord Frederick Lindemann, was openly furious. Lindemann had a long-standing rivalry with Tizard, and he seized on this proposal as proof of his opponent's poor judgment. He warned Churchill in the strongest possible terms that the Americans would simply take British inventions and offer nothing meaningful in return. Britain would give away its technological advantage and receive only vague promises of future cooperation. The argument was not unreasonable. America was officially neutral. There was no guarantee that the United States would ever enter the war, and even if they did, Would they really share the fruits of their industrial production with Britain? But the situation was desperate. After Dunkirk, after the fall of France, after months of bombing and blockade, Britain had no realistic alternative. The nation was surviving, but only barely. Every week brought fresh losses in the Atlantic. Every night brought more bombs falling on British homes. American industrial capacity, by contrast, was enormous. American factories were safely beyond the reach of any German bomber. American steel mills and electronics plants could produce in weeks what British industry would need years to manufacture. The War Cabinet debated, they argued, and in the end, they approved the mission. Years later, Vernon Gibson of the British Ministry of Defence would look back on what happened next and try to put it into words. He called the Tizard Mission a desperate act of trust that sowed the seeds for future victory and collaboration. In August of 1940, a black metal deed box began its long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Inside was not just the cavity magnetron. The box contained blueprints for Frank Whittle's revolutionary jet engine, technology that would transform aviation for generations to come. There were designs for new plastic explosives and proximity fuses that could detonate a shell at exactly the right moment. Technical specifications for British submarine detection systems were carefully folded alongside. And buried among those papers was something even more secret than all the rest: the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum. Two refugee scientists had calculated that an atomic bomb was not merely theoretically possible, it could actually be built. And they had outlined exactly how to do it. Britain was about to hand over virtually every scientific advantage it possessed, gambling everything on a nation that had not yet decided whether to join the fight. The night before the mission departed, the most valuable secret in British history spent the night under a hotel bed. Dr. Edward George Bowen, known to everyone as Taffy, was the radar expert assigned to carry the magnetron to America. He had checked into a London hotel with the black metal deed box, and he had nowhere secure to store it. So he simply slid it under his bed and tried to sleep. The next morning, things became even more absurd. Bowen needed to get from his hotel to Euston Station to catch the train to Liverpool. He hailed a taxi. But the box would not fit comfortably inside the vehicle with his other luggage, so the driver strapped it to the roof of the cab. The most closely guarded secret of the British war effort traveled through the streets of London, tied to the top of a taxicab with ordinary rope. At Euston Station, the situation nearly became a disaster. Bowen was struggling with his bags when an eager railway porter spotted the black box and decided to be helpful. Before Bowen could react, the man grabbed the deed box and sprinted off toward the Liverpool train. For several terrifying seconds, Bowen lost sight of him completely in the crowded station. He pushed through the passengers, heart pounding, and found the porter waiting cheerfully by the correct carriage, the box safely in hand. Britain's greatest secret had almost vanished into the chaos of a busy railway platform. On the 29th of August 1940, the team of 7 men boarded the Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond at Liverpool. The crossing would take over a week, 8 days of sailing through waters that were infested with German submarines. The deed box had been specially designed for exactly this possibility. If a torpedo struck the ship, the container would automatically fill with water and sink to the bottom of the Atlantic. The secrets inside would be lost forever, but they would never fall into enemy hands. For 8 days, the team waited and watched the gray ocean. Every shadow on the horizon could be a periscope. Every distant sound could be a torpedo. On the 6th of September, the Duchess of Richmond arrived safely in Halifax, Canada. The box had made it across the Atlantic. Inside sat the cavity magnetron, the jet engine blueprints, the proximity fuse designs, the submarine detection plans, and the memorandum explaining how to build an atomic bomb. Now came the moment that would determine whether any of it had been worth the risk. On the 19th of September, 1940, a group of American scientists gathered in a private apartment at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. They had been told the British were bringing something important. They had no idea what. Taffy Bowen opened the black metal box. Dr. Alfred Loomis was a wealthy physicist who headed the Microwave Committee for the National Defense Research Committee. He had spent months trying to solve the same problem that had defeated every laboratory in America: how to generate enough microwave power to make centimetric radar practical. Now, he stood in his apartment at the Wardman Park Hotel, staring at a small copper cylinder that a British scientist had just pulled from a black metal box. Taffy Bowen would later describe the moment in his memoirs. He wrote that the atmosphere in that room was electric. The American scientists passed the magnetron from hand to hand, examining it, turning it over, struggling to believe what they were being told. This small device, this thing that looked like industrial scrap, could generate 10,000 watts of microwave power. The Americans were stunned into silence. Their best klystron tubes produced approximately 10 watts at centimeter wavelengths. The British magnetron produced 1,000 times more power. It was not an incremental improvement. It was not a modest step forward. It was a complete transformation of what was technically possible. Bowen recalled that they found it hard to believe such a small device could produce so much power. They kept asking questions. They checked the specifications again and again. And slowly, the realization spread through the room that what lay on the table in front of them might prove to be the salvation of the Allied cause. The Americans moved with extraordinary speed. On the 6th of October 1940, engineers at Bell Telephone Laboratories successfully operated the British magnetron for the first time on American soil. It worked exactly as promised. On the 25th of October, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology formally established a new research facility dedicated to developing microwave radar. They called it the Radiation Laboratory, a name chosen deliberately to mislead anyone who asked questions. People would assume it was connected to nuclear physics. They would not guess it was actually developing radar. The Rad Lab would eventually employ nearly 4,000 people. It would design approximately half of all radar systems used by the Allies during the war. And by the time the conflict ended, Bell Labs alone would manufacture over 1 million cavity magnetrons. Years later, James Finney Baxter, the official historian of the United States Office of Scientific Research and Development, would try to put the significance of that moment into words. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, he wrote that when the members of the Tizard Mission brought the magnetron to America in 1940, they carried the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. The invention had crossed the Atlantic. The factories were ready to build it. Now came the true test. The cavity magnetron had to prove itself in combat, and the first battlefield would be the cold, gray, deadly waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In February of 1943, a new radar system entered service with Royal Air Force Coastal Command. It was designated ASV Mark III, and it was the first operational radar to use the cavity magnetron. The system operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters. This technical detail would prove to be decisive, because German submarines had no idea it existed. The U-boat fleet had developed a detector called METOX, a device that could pick up the signals from older British radar systems. When a patrol aircraft approached, the METOX receiver would sound an alarm, giving the submarine crew precious minutes to dive beneath the waves and escape. The German submariners believed they had solved the radar problem. They thought they were safe. They were catastrophically wrong. The new centimetric radar operated on a completely different wavelength. METOX could not detect it at all. The U-boats would surface at night, confident that their warning systems would alert them to any approaching aircraft, and they would hear nothing. The sky would seem empty and safe. Then, a British bomber would appear out of the darkness, guided straight to the submarine by invisible microwave beams. At the last moment, the pilot would switch on the lee light, a powerful searchlight that illuminated the surfaced U-boat like a spotlight on a stage. Seconds later, depth charges would fall. The effect was devastating. Before the lee light combination was introduced, Coastal Command aircraft had managed to destroy precisely 0 submarines over a 5-month period, while losing 6 aircraft in the attempt. After the new system became operational, U-boats began to vanish at an alarming rate. The situation became so desperate that German submarine commanders made an extraordinary decision. They began surfacing during daylight hours instead of at night. They reasoned that at least in daylight, they could see the attacking aircraft coming and fight back with anti-aircraft guns. The darkness that had once protected them had become a trap. May of 1943 would become known in German naval history as Black May. In that single month, Allied forces destroyed 43 U-boats, 25% of the entire operational submarine fleet. The losses were unsustainable. Meanwhile, Allied shipping losses plummeted from 120 vessels in March to just 58 in May. Total tonnage lost dropped from 400,000 tons per month to barely 100,000. On the 24th of May, 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz made a decision he had never expected to make. He ordered a temporary halt to U-boat operations in the North Atlantic. The submarines withdrew to regroup and develop countermeasures. Years later, U-boat commander Heinz Schaefer would reflect on what had happened. He wrote that it was impossible to tell the story of the submarine war without discussing radar. It turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic against Germany at the most critical moment of the entire war. The power of the U-boat fleet, he admitted, was shattered overnight. But the Atlantic was only the beginning. The cavity magnetron was about to transform the air war over Germany itself. While the Battle of the Atlantic raged below, another revolution was taking place in the skies over occupied Europe. British scientists had developed a new application for the cavity magnetron, a radar system designated H2S. It was the first airborne radar in history that could see the ground below. A rotating antenna in the belly of a bomber sent microwave pulses downward. The returning signals painted a picture on a screen in front of the navigator. Water appeared dark. Open fields showed gray, and cities glowed bright with reflections from thousands of buildings. For the first time, bomber crews could see exactly where they were flying, even through cloud cover, even on the darkest night. On the 30th of January 1943, H2S was used operationally for the first time against Hamburg. Before H2S, British night bombing accuracy was appalling. Only one bomb in 20 landed within 5 miles of its target. After H2S, Pathfinder aircraft would mark targets with colored flares, and the main bomber stream would aim for them. Precision replaced guesswork. In July 1943, Operation Gomorrah sent 750 bombers against Hamburg. The firestorms claimed approximately 45,000 lives. The Germans captured an H2S set from a downed bomber near Rotterdam. When they reconstructed it and switched it on, the city of Berlin appeared clearly on the display. Near panic broke out among Luftwaffe commanders. Every German city was now visible to British bombers, regardless of weather or darkness. By January 1944, every major bombing raid was led by radar-equipped aircraft. A 5-month campaign systematically targeted German aircraft factories and Luftwaffe airfields. The attrition was relentless. On the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day, the results became clear. 160,000 troops landed on Normandy beaches. Above them, the skies were almost empty of German aircraft. The Luftwaffe had been ground down into ineffectiveness. The MIT Technology Review would later observe that if the cavity magnetron had not been invented in November 1939, D-Day might never have happened at all. The war ended. The magnetron had helped win it. But what happened to the two men who created it? Their fates would prove remarkably and unfairly different. When the war ended, the British government faced the question of how to reward the men who had invented the cavity magnetron. Their initial answer was almost insulting. Randall and Boot each received £50. 50 pounds. For an invention that Americans would call the most valuable cargo ever brought to their shores. In 1949, the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors finally acknowledged the true significance of what had been achieved. They awarded £36,000 to be shared among Randall, Boot, and James Sayers, who had later improved the magnetron's stability. A substantial sum, but shared 3 ways and almost a decade late. What happened next to the two co-inventors could hardly have been more different. John Randall's career soared. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1946. He became head of a biophysics unit at King's College London, where his team produced crucial X-ray images of DNA, the work that helped Watson and Crick discover the double helix. In 1962, 17 years after the war, Randall received a knighthood. He became Sir John. Harry Boot's path was quieter. He remained in the civil service, researching magnetrons, then plasma physics and lasers. Important work, but not the kind that attracted honors. He retired in 1977. He never received a knighthood. In 1975, the Sunday Times published a photograph of the two men. The caption read, "Professor Sir John Randall and Dr. Harry Boot." One title, one ordinary honorific. They had invented the same device, on the same day, in the same room, and history treated them very differently. But the legacy of what they created together would outlast both of them. And that legacy is closer than you might think. In 1945, an American engineer named Percy Spencer was standing near a working magnetron at the Raytheon Corporation. He noticed something peculiar. The chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. Any other engineer might have cursed his ruined snack and moved on. Spencer stopped and experimented. He placed popcorn kernels near the magnetron and watched them explode into fluffy pieces. He tried an egg. It cooked from the inside and splattered a colleague. Percy Spencer did not invent the cavity magnetron. That honor belongs to Randall and Boot. But he discovered that microwaves could heat food. Today, 93% of British households own a microwave oven. Inside every single one sits a cavity magnetron, a direct descendant of that copper block built in Birmingham more than 80 years ago. Every time you heat a cup of tea or warm up yesterday's dinner, you are using technology that helped win the Second World War. The device that hunted submarines and guided bombers now sits quietly in your kitchen. In June of 2024, 84 years after the breakthrough, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers unveiled a commemorative plaque on the Pointing Building at Birmingham. The original magnetron sits in the Science Museum in London. You can see it, a small copper cylinder that looks too simple to have mattered so much. Some historians argue that radar helped win the war more than the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb ended the Pacific War, but was used only twice. Radar influenced every single day of the conflict, from the Battle of Britain to D-Day. Harry Boot passed away in February 1983. John Randall followed in June 1984. Neither lived to see that commemorative plaque. Two men from ordinary backgrounds, a block of copper, a horseshoe magnet, some wax to seal the gaps. They built a device that crossed the Atlantic in a black metal box, a device that an American historian would describe as the most valuable cargo ever brought to American shores. Those are not British words. That is what the Americans themselves concluded. Two forgotten inventors, one small copper cylinder, and a legacy that changed the world.